10 years ago, the word narcissist hit the mainstream. And for a lot of people, it was liberating. It gave language to something they'd felt for years but didn't know how to name. And maybe that's you. Maybe you've been in a relationship that left you confused, hurt, and doubting your own reality. And when you finally heard the word, it all clicked. Or maybe that's not you. Maybe the word has started to feel loaded, weaponized even, like it's lost the clarity that once made it so powerful. And you've been on the receiving end of that, and it's made you angry. Because while narcissism is real and devastating, the conversation has been hijacked. It's become a catch-all for hard relationships, and in the process, it's lost the nuance we need to actually heal. And the stakes here are massive. Mislabel someone, and you could destroy a relationship that's simply struggling. Miss a true narcissist, and you stay in a cycle that erodes your sense of self. Either way, the cost is high, and the internet isn't helping. That's why we sat down with Dr. Ramani Durvasula, one of the leading voices who helped bring this language into the public square. A licensed psychologist with millions of followers, 3 best-selling books, and decades of work focused on the realities of emotional abuse, she's here to reclaim the conversation, to bring nuance back, and to help you find your way through the mess. If you're a new listener, at Mighty Pursuit, we help you make sense of life by looking at the whole person, mind, body, and spirit, not as wellness cliches, but as deeply interconnected parts of your everyday experience. Today's episode zooms into our wisdom category, how to navigate relationships wisely. But it also has massive implications for our mental health, because how we label people, how we protect ourselves, and how we learn to love again after harm might be some of the most important work we ever do. So in this conversation, we go deep into what narcissism really is and what it absolutely isn't, and why that difference matters more than ever. We explore how labels can offer clarity or become weapons, and how healing requires more than just naming the problem. It requires knowing what to do next. Because this isn't just about calling people out. It's about what we do with the pain and how we move forward without losing our ability to connect, to trust, or to love again. Dr. Ramani, your latest book opens with 2 stories, Carlos and Adam. And when I read those stories, I couldn't help but those 2 men side by side kind of perfectly capture a lot of the confusion around the conversation about abusive relationships and narcissism. So can you take us into those 2 stories and kind of what they represent?
Right. So, when it was a hard book to open up, right? And again, what's narcissism? So let's talk a little bit about Carlos. Carlos he's a sweet guy, probably a little emotionally immature, but he'll always come over and lend you a tool, and he wants to have fun, and he'll take people to a barbecue, and he's a good boyfriend, and he's devoted to his partner, and then he drinks too much in Las Vegas, and he always wants to spend time with his friends. If anything, there's a friction. The one friction with his girlfriend is he wants to spend time with his friends. He sort of Carlos is kind of like that big dumb dog. I want to go with my friends, and we're going to go to the casino. We're going to go to the game. And she'll say, can we please be more serious? And can we focus on being adults together and all of that? Well, Carlos goes to Vegas with his friends, and it's a bit of a makeout, kind of a light sex kind of a thing, and it's a one-night stand. He had been drinking too much. He's aware of what he did, and he's devastated, and he fesses up to his partner. I did this, and I am so sorry, and I hurt you, and he apologizes, and he takes accountability. But Carlos is a cheater at that point. That's how we could think of Carlos.
Yeah.
In the other story, we have somebody who is the stand-up guy. He is, on paper, the guy he follows the rules. He has the job. He would never dream of looking at another woman. He pays the bills on time. He shows up on time. He is very, very responsible. He is also chronically invalidating to his partner. He believes he deserves special treatment. He thinks that he's the only one who's ever had a problem. Do I have a target on my back? And everyone's out to get me. And it's constant victimization. And his partner's really suffering in the relationship. But everyone tells her, gosh, he's such a stand-up guy. Adam's such a stand-up guy. So she's with this guy who really to the world looks like a great guy because he does. He will actually come and shovel people's driveways. He'll remind them later, "Oh, I did shovel your driveway," but he'll do it. He'll do the thing. And when people look at those two stories, Carlos, the kind of sloppy, messy, drinking with the guys, probably a little too flirty, gets messy, has the one-night stand, or Adam, the stand-up guy who will shovel the driveway and help people with their problems and has held the same job and pillar of the community, who's chronically invalidating to his partner and kind of believes that he deserves something better than anyone else because he is such a great guy. Who do we think the narcissist is? And the vast majority of people will put their money on Carlos because there's something quite grandiose about Carlos. He gets all the attention. It's his barbecue. He's so fun. He's so attention-seeking. He's not arrogant. We might miss it there, but then Carlos cheats, right? And everyone who cheats is a narcissist.
Yeah.
And I did that deliberately in this book. In the era we're in, and social media and this word, narcissism, percolating up into the public conversation, people want this to be an easy-to-use word, like, oh, he cheated. Every cheater's a narcissist. Not true, by the way. So it's so easy to sort of say the grandiose, overgrown child man who does things like has a one-night stand is clearly the narcissist, not the stand-up guy. So sure, treats his wife bad, but he does all the right things and he's never cheated on her and he'd never do anything immoral. So that really opens up this bigger question. What is morality? What is empathy? What is healthy behavior in a relationship? And I'll ask you this question. Would you rather be invalidated every day for 10 years? Or would you rather be cheated on for one night? Personally, me, I'd rather be cheated on.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain effect of a chronic thing that's happening in a relationship, and the level of trauma in which that will create. And I think what those two examples reveal is like the tension we're sitting in right now, because when you released, should I say or should I go 10 years ago, hit the public square. It's like iconic, a very liberating conversation for many people because it gave language to something that they were observing in their own relationships, and so beautiful in that way. And I think that what happened from that point, as like the narcissism language has like gone from the early work with that into the conversation today, I think there's just been a lot of conflation and confusion, especially with that example, right? So you have some people who might think they're in a narcissistic relationship, but it's not actually a narcissistic relationship. So they start applying the techniques and rules that you would need to. And so that causes its own set of problems and might hurt the relationship more than helping it. And then you have some of these examples, which we'll get into, of someone who might actually be narcissistic hijacking the narcissism language and then like pinning that on the other person, right? So it's become this like weird word and language where it's like diluting the meaning. And you covered this at length in the book, but where, like, as you sit back and think about the past 10 years, like the liberation of the conversation and then like all the education around it, and now what some of the people are doing are getting confused now, where do you feel like the conversation sits right now in terms of culture, therapy, relationships? And where has it went off track?
It's a really, really great question because this is a mental health concept that has percolated into the public conversation and has tremendous, tremendous ramifications for the world economy, even geopolitics. It's a strange, depression doesn't quite do that, but narcissism does. Before 2016, working in narcissism was a pretty lonely place. Like, I don't want to say nobody cared. The only people who cared were people like me who were sort of like, we're in our labs taking this apart, or people who were going through these relationships but still didn't have the vocabulary. So when Should I Stay or Should I Go came out, it was still very much a relational issue. And a lot of the work on narcissism was focused on the grandiose side of things, right? These sorts of leaderly, entitled, arrogant kinds of types. In 2016, and it wasn't just in the United States, it was around the world, the political landscape changed. And you had a lot of, for lack of a better term, baby men becoming leaders all over the world. And in its wake, we sort of also saw this other response in terms of the kinds of traits, qualities, behaviors that were getting valued at a societal level. And this was now going to have implications for relationships, for success, for metrics of success, all of that. But where the storm entirely coalesced was social media, which is where people go to get help with their relationships. Our YouTube channel had been around for a long time, but it really got ahead of steam in 2019 when the entire focus became narcissism and pretty quickly jumped from 100,000 to 1 million subscribers. And there was a reason for that. It was because we were giving concentrated content on that topic. But I think what all of this is culminated in is a really useful word that has gotten so distorted that nobody's using it correctly. People tend to pull one strand out of narcissism. They'll talk just about selfishness, just about arrogance, just about entitlement, and treat it like it's the whole thing. And the problem is, if you do that, there's lots of selfish people out there. There's lots of entitled people out there. There's lots of arrogant people out there. There's lots of passive-aggressive people out there. There are not a lot of narcissistic people out there. And the reason for that is you got to have all the stuff, right? So people might be one of those things, or like our friend Carlos here. He's a big, messy guy, but he's actually quite empathic. He takes a lot of responsibility and accountability for his behavior. He didn't do that to her before, and he doesn't do it again. He changes his behavior in the relationship. So Carlos is not narcissistic. But you can easily see how Carlos's girlfriend might have said that if she was watching Instagram reels about narcissism. And so the word has gotten so co-opted, and we've muddied what could actually be a really healing conversation for people who experience certain forms of relational trauma, not to mention if people were actually paying attention to how this word worked, how this narcissism thing works, we might be making very different kinds of decisions in elections and things like that. Maybe not. I don't know. I mean, narcissistic people have always been overrepresented in leadership. That doesn't seem to be changing.
Yeah, I think the stakes of the conversation are so high. I mean, the divorce rate is well established of 50%, but I mean, that doesn't even account for the people that are in incredibly unhappy relationships,
Correct.
Toxic dynamics,
Correct.
Stuff like that. And then you throw the narcissism thing in. And, I see, we've had a lot of guests on the show, and I see like themes. One of the guests we had the other day was Ellen Langer at Harvard, mindfulness. But, there's so much work around even like labeling theory. And for example, if someone gets charged with a crime and they weren't necessarily convicted, maybe they're even innocent, as soon as you put a title on them of they were accused of this crime, and maybe they were proven innocent. As soon as they have that label on them, it's like you might start seeing everything through that lens. And so I feel like it could be similar, because I thought what was so special about that book 10 years ago is the power was you were describing all the dynamics. You were describing all the details, all the nuance, and I'm like, yes. And then when we just lose all of that, and then it's like, I'm having a tough time in my relationship, which I totally sympathize with the person. And then I'm just going to insert this word into the conversation. I think it might, in their own pain, it is something that makes sense to you're in such pain, you want to label something, but it might not necessarily be the right approach in the moment. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I have very few like absolute pieces of advice for people, but one of my few absolutes, my personal law of gravity, is never tell a narcissistic person you think they're narcissistic. Do not use this word in your relationship. It's a forbidden, no fly, never speak of it, okay? The reason the word is useful is because it's the first time, and I say this in as many words in the book, it's the first time some people's pain had a name. I had a really interesting conversation with a woman the other day who had been in a narcissistic relationship with a partner whom she did not marry, okay? And it was abusive, and it was toxic, and it was manipulative, and it was betraying, and it was all these things, right? The relationship ends. A couple of years later, she gets into a relationship with another man, a different man, different in many ways in terms of how he presented in the relationship. And in that relationship, it was manipulative and abusive and harmful, and it even escalated more into physical abuse. And she said, the reason this word is so important was it wasn't until I got out of the second relationship where I really was harmed that I'd heard this word. And now I knew this was both of these people.
Yeah.
I thought I was in a difficult relationship. Difficult relationship is diffuse. It's like snowflakes, right? There's as many different difficult relationships as there are two people to have in a relationship. Narcissistic implies that this cluster, this sequelae of traits hangs together in a really specific and really consistent way. But the one big takeaway we can have, and I know not everyone agrees with me, but it's pretty much held the test of time, especially when we're talking about more moderate to severe narcissism. These patterns aren't going to change. And I'm going to be pretty frank with you. Matthew, you have a personality, and I have a personality. And if I spent enough time with you and maybe gave you a test or two, I'd know what your personality is. And that personality, if I talk to a parent or someone who was around you as a child, they'll say, yeah, this Matthew sitting in front of you now is kind of 6-year-old Matthew. We've trimmed a couple of things off the edge, but this was the little boy. And if you have siblings, you might even have different personality than them, right? Personality is consistent. And by and large, the research suggests even with a healthy personality. And the healthier the personality, the more flexible it is. Like there's more adaptation that can be made, and there's more flexibility in understanding things and all that. An agreeable person, by definition, is a flexible person. Agreeableness is a personality type, right? Agreeable, I would love to see you or me or any shrink in the world take an agreeable person and make them disagreeable through therapy. Now, people would say, well, you're really going to do that? Use therapy to take someone and take them out of a healthy state into an unhealthy state? Probably not. But to the degree agreeableness isn't amenable to change, why the hell would narcissism be amenable to change? And that's an inflexible style. And add to that, the only times we really see personality change significantly, it's really two situations. Organic brain change, head injury, stroke, other organic process like a tumor, something like that. And number two would be trauma, significant trauma. And a lot of post-traumatic growth is actually post-traumatic personality change. But that often can sometimes be in a good direction, sometimes not. And many people would argue that narcissism is a post-traumatic state. So it gets complicated, right? And I've seen in my clinical practice, the more post-traumatic someone's narcissism is, the more we can do with them therapeutically, because we can do more trauma-informed work, and we can kind of cut through some of that icky schmutz, as I'd put it.
Yeah, no, I think that's so important to understand, because there's to not trivialize the issue, and the people that are actually victims in these situations. I mean, when I was watching one of your videos, it really came into light for me about the difference between lying and gaslighting. Right, so there's a wrong that's happened, and so someone who has lied, Carlos, might end up fessing up to it and be apologetic,
and be accountable.
Yeah,
that's
and
the
so
key.
but gaslighting is quite different. So can you explain the difference of how that would manifest?
It's
in
a
relationship?
crucial. Gaslight was the word of the year in 2023, right?
Yeah.
We're misusing gaslight as much as we misuse narcissism. A lot of people think gaslighting is lying, right? I never said that. I never did that. They don't have the best pizza in town. That's not gaslighting. That's either lying or it's a difference in opinion, right? Now, about the gaslight comes. If you and I were having an argument, I say, Matthew, I never said that. I never did that. Where are you getting this from? Like, you're so weird and you're kind of paranoid and weirdly delusional. Like, oh. And then I'm doing that to you. I'm gaslighting you then. Because it's no longer, I never said that, I never did that. Okay, that's already me challenging your perception. But then me telling you that there's something wrong with you. And that gambit gets repeated over and over and over again. And you have some trust or attachment or care for me, then that is where gaslighting gets its power from, because you want to remain attached to me, right? You want to remain close to me. So you're like, maybe this is plausible. And if you fight me on it, then I'll say, you know what, Matthew, I'm done. I can't do this. You're too weird. And you want to stay in the relationship. You're like, no, I'm just not going to bring this up to her anymore. And now, little by little, I've indoctrinated you. This is how cults work. This is how modern politics works. And this is how gaslighted relationships work. So to the world, it kind of looks like you're with me. Like Matthew never fights back with her, And so he's got her figured out. No. we've sort of canceled Matthew. Matthew cannot exist in this relationship.
There's a power that,
There's a huge power. And usually gaslighting can be engaged in by the more powerful person in the relationship. And by powerful, what I mean is that power is what matters to them. Don't assume that gaslighting only happens because one person has all the money or one person has a physical strength. Sometimes it's just that one person is willing to have manipulation be the ground game. But gaslighting is that point where you switch it and you say, there's something wrong with you. Not only am I denying your reality, your experience, your memory, and your perception, I'm doubling down and telling you there's something wrong with you. That's gaslighting.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't imagine we're talking about trauma offline, but the relational trauma that would unfold of, let's just go back to the cheating example. Someone's cheating, and then that person then goes, what's the matter with you? Like, why would you ever think this?
Right.
This is ridiculous. Maybe even like get angry.
Oh yeah.
And there's an unapologetic type like demeanor that they have. And then you think you're going crazy. You're seeing something happen out of like what? Okay. And then at a later point, maybe it is revealed, but definitively, like, no, they actually were cheating. And so it's like wrongdoing happened and there was no copying up, but there was a doubling down.
It's the double down, but it's a double down to dismantle the other person, right? And gaslighting is very much an indoctrination process. That's why I say to people, the earlier you know what it is, so if it is happening to you, gaslighters are often testing their environment, right? If it works, it's not as conscious as I'm sort of painting it out to be, but you're a soft target now, right? Whereas maybe someone you don't care about as much, maybe it's a first date, maybe it's just a friend, but you meet someone and they gaslight, you're like, oh, hell no, that happened, I said it, and don't call me crazy. Now you're no longer interesting to that person, right? And so they're probably going to walk too. But this is a harder game to play a few months in when you feel invested.
Yeah.
And for people with histories of trauma are often more gaslightable because self-doubt is something that can linger for a longer period of time in trauma survivors. Usually, if we think of, for example, Gabor Mate and folks like that have talked about this, because the vast majority of trauma survivors are not protected, right? To have the experience of trauma validated to them, self-doubt tends to be a fellow traveler for most trauma survivors.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like this all kind of underlines the need to get this equation right. And so there are a number of things and strategies in which you would deal with that person if they actually are a narcissist, right? So applied correctly, like that will be extremely effective, like hopefully for your relationship and help you get some healing and distance. But applied incorrectly to the wrong relationship dynamics, it could be harmful. So, going back to Carlos and Adam, like the whole idea of gray rocking, can you explain what that is and why that would be a terrible thing to do if someone is not actually a narcissist?
Exactly.
Yes.
So gray rocking, and in a moment I'm going to tell you why I don't like it, okay? But it's a commonly cited narcissism management strategy. It's what it sounds like. A gray rock is a boring thing that you don't notice because it's just a gray rock. It's inert, you don't notice it, it blends into the background. So gray rocking is to be boring, one-word answers, relatively emotionless. Yes, no, okay, sure. The idea is that if you keep doing that, you don't give the narcissist the fight, you don't give the person, you don't go down the rabbit hole with them again, they'll get bored of you. It's not quite that simple. The problem with gray rocking is it's unsettling for other people in the environment. So if there's minor children involved, if there's colleagues involved, if there's other family members involved, they're going to be put off. It actually feels like the antagonist now is the gray rocker who's giving these one-word answers, right? Especially if you don't have the whole context of the relationship as something you understand. A friend of mine, Tina Swithin, who's is an advocate in this space, she talks about yellow rocking. Everyone's like, why yellow? Apparently Tina likes yellow. But what she means by yellow rocking is take the gray rock technique, but infuse it with a little, to be a little warmer. So if you'd say, oh, hey, oh, wow, cool, that sounds like fun. you don't care. But the other people listening to it actually sounds like you're engaged in the conversation, but you're trying to make it go away. Now, for Carlos, who is not a bad guy, a little bit of an overgrown adolescent, but if his partner had gone right to gray rock, there may not have been that opportunity for repair. Right? Repair is how healthy relationships keep going. In fact, repair is how healthy relationships keep climbing the ladder. Is people think, oh, a good relationship is just a relationship with no problems. I'm like, no. Good relationship is a relationship with problems that go through repair, because that's how you climb the stairway. And repair is accountability, it's responsibility taking, and it's change, which Carlos ultimately would do. He'd take responsibility. He would change. He wouldn't do that anymore. And he's like, okay, I've got to clean up my act, and wouldn't blame his partner, because classically a narcissistic person, in the case of betrayal or any breach of trust, would usually blame the partner when their back was finally against the wall. You stopped having sex with me, or you don't pay attention to me, or you're not even that into the things I tell you about. So they now make their breach about the other person. So sadly, in a narcissistic relationship, there's a lot of trial by error. Most people in relationships are moving in good faith. They're assuming that the other person is feeling connected, is involved in the same way. They're not realizing that in a narcissistic relationship, the other person in the relationship is very much an object, there to fulfill need, to provide status, someone to have control over. Well, if you're not given that instruction manual, you're going to interact with them as though it's healthy. But if you gray rock in a healthy relationship, it really feels like misattunement, disconnection, disengagement. And again, any attempts at repair may not actually get their chance to breathe. But however, if you are with a narcissistic person, the flip side to your question, and you keep using the tried and true self-help book communication strategies,
it doesn't work.
You're just going to get buried deeper and deeper.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of people might not understand or have maybe read your first book and all the different ways to differentiate and between these two types of people, which we'll get to. But like sometimes we'll take just a behavior that we see in a relationship. For example, let's just say your boyfriend forgets an anniversary twice, right? And instead of naming that hurt, you call them a narcissist. Correct. And then block them everywhere. So in that case, we're just using, because the whole idea of blocking and like cutting off communication, right? We're using a tool that could be right in a certain situation with a narcissist, but again, it's the wrong situation. So how do you help people tell the difference between something that's going to be a wise boundary that they're setting and something potentially that might be a premature escape in a healthier type relationship?
So you give an interesting example here, right? So the partner forgets the anniversary twice.
Yeah.
Okay. If indeed the person's response to that is, we're done and you're blocked, okay, I wonder about both people in that relationship at that point, right? What I want to see people do, it's actually something in the book I talk about, it is going into the tiger's cage, right? I'm a cat person. What can I tell you? So I have a lovely little cat. And so, but if in the cage, there's a cage and there's a tiger in it and you're like, I don't know, is that a pretty little cat I can pet or is that a tiger? I'm like, go into the cage. And if you go into that cage and if it's a tiger, you kind of get it a little bit torn or completely torn apart. And if it's a cat, well, then she's going to sit on your lap and you're going to pet her. Okay. Going into the tiger's cage is communicate about the missed anniversary. Okay. So let's say year one, that person said nothing. Okay. It came, it went. Finally, they do something anemic or tepid for the anniversary. Year two comes and it's forgotten again. Now, let's assume something was said in year one, like, hey, I was hurt that you didn't remember the anniversary, boyfriend throws something together, whatever. Next year it comes again. The tiger's cage of it all is you go in there and you have the conversation. Okay, you say, here we are again. It is it's June 20th. You've forgotten again. This mattered to me last year. I brought it up. And here we are again. Now, this is the tiger's cage piece. If boyfriend says, are you really that immature that we are sitting here fighting about some lame dating anniversary? Grow up. Tiger. Pay attention. And my guess is this guy is not a nice guy all the other times. You're being given a huge piece of data. If the person says, oh my gosh, this is so not okay, and maybe even has a deeper conversation with you about what this is about without saying, first of all, I hurt you and this was not okay. I can tell you a little bit about me, but that's neither here nor there on why this is so hard for me. And you may learn something about that partner. You may still not like, you might say, listen, anniversaries are the hill I'm going to die on. So this may not work. Then know that too. But you got to have the conversation. You got to go in the tiger's cage. You got to see what comes back at you, because that data is not a point in isolation. It's going to line up with everything else you're learning. If this is a Carlos situation and he's a sweetheart, he remembers everything else. There's notes in your lunch. He's never left you high and dry at the airport. He is attentive to your friends. He hears you, talks to you about your life. You feel a sense of empathy, connection, and above all, psychological safety. And all this fool is doing is forgetting your anniversary. We're in a Carlos situation. Okay, really, like, you want to say, let's put some reminders in this man's phone, okay, to get this one right. But if this is somebody who immediately goes to, you childish, ridiculous person, you're a fool that this matters to you with no accountability, now we're in an Adam situation. The data is there. You have to have the conversation. That's the tiger's cage. You can't always just say, well, here's the patterns, I got this. Go in there, have the conversation, see what comes back. You know what most people do, and I'm going to call this my blackjack analogy, because in addition to cats, I like playing cards. So you're learning all of my little peccadillos. But blackjack, right? Everybody plays it wrong. It's been a long time since I was in a casino, but I go just to watch this happen. You play blackjack?
I've played blackjack.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm the dealer. I've got a 10 up. My whole card's down. You know what I got? I got 10 up. You're dealt a 16. What's the play?
Probably hold.
No. So, see, we're going to teach you something today, Matthew. You hit the 16.
Why?
Proper blackjack, unless you're counting cards on single deck blackjack. If you're playing multi-deck blackjack in a shoe, unless you're some sort of genius who can count that. The reason you don't is, what's my card you can't see? What's the assumption that whole card is that you can't see?
Well, the assumption is that you're going to have multiple turns and that I'm going to get something over a 5. And
What's
then
my
I'm
whole
break it.
card? What card is most prevalent in a deck? What value is most prevalent in a deck?
Well, I guess I'm scared of the ace, but I mean, probably going to get something that's...
No, wouldn't be an ace, because they would have let you get insurance and they would have blown that hand, right? You always assume the whole card's a 10.
Okay.
So that means I've got a
20.
Which means I
Win.
no matter what.
Yeah.
Okay? Unless you hit that 16 with a 5 or a 4. The odds of that are much lower than you busting. If I've got a 10, you're probably going to get a 10. The point is that most people sit on that 16 because there's still some hope that the dealer could bust.
Yeah.
The odds that the dealer is going to bust are really low. The courageous play is to take the card and see the hand all the way through. Nobody does it. I'm like, oh, this is why people have relationship problems. It's the same thing in a relationship. You got to hit the hand. You got to hit the hand. You got to have the conversation. And you know why people don't? Because they don't always want to see what this relationship really is. If you don't hit the hand, then you can still stay in the delusion of like, oh, this is just a misunderstanding.
I think what's interesting is when you're speaking there was this TV show that came out on Netflix, and I don't want to say that this was true about this person, but anyway, there's the story of the founding of Uber, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt played the founder, right? And so he's very early stage, humble, has a girlfriend, and as he gets more and more powerful with this company, it is like this God complex that like starts to take over, and sometimes we romanticize, well, what would it be like to be with someone who's like super powerful, or they have a lot of money, or they're really beautiful, or whatever. And you might get in one of these situations where they will be on the anniversary, and it'll be like, well, don't you know who I am? You know, yeah.
I know a really nice lady who wrote that book.
Yeah, exactly. Don't you know who I am? Like I'm so important. I'm like saving the world through Uber. Like how would you expect me to remember this whole thing? And so again, there's this romanticization with public figures and whatnot. But it made me think about that because it's just like a breeding ground of like you need to have the conversations, and it's hard maybe in the beginning, but there probably is some sort of red flags or things trends that you might be able to notice. But I think with some of these roles in society, I mean, it's just kind of par for the course of how we are training people to think about themselves.
We absolutely are, but I'd argue that somebody who had tremendous success in a business or something like that, the God complex doesn't come out of nowhere. There is a seed in a person. I know a lot of people who are hyper agreeable, humble, honest people. They're not God complexing on you. They're just going to kind of keep humbly making their money. They might be, run their team a certain way and expectations may be high, but they're not going to do something like, don't you know who I am? I can't remember something as ridiculous as an anniversary. But it does take us to this bigger issue, which is one of the parts of this conversation that are hard is that the hardest part of a healthy relationship is how much awareness we have of what we need in a relationship, what you need, what I need, what anyone else in the world needs in a relationship. It's all a little bit different. There's some things we want. We want honesty. We want trust, respect, shared values. These tend to be psychological safety. These are universals, right? But even what that psychological safety is, it's going to look a little different from person to person. We rarely sit down and say, and I'm not saying the ridiculous list people make, like, plays the guitar, went to Cornell. No, I'm not talking that list. I'm talking like, what is it? What are your values? What matters to you in a relationship? And that could be anything from how spare time is spent, what is ambition about, how do you want children, how you raise those children, spiritual core, again, a lot of it is around values orientation, a lot of that. We don't think about that. And it could be, how much does an anniversary matter to me? And sometimes we don't want to fess up to that, but it's the most important thing a person could do is say, anniversaries matter to me.
Yeah.
But it's hitting that 16. People are worried that if I say this matters, then I'm going to lose this person. I'm like, well, then you're going to spend the rest of your life with somebody who keeps forgetting the anniversaries. And once a year, you're going to have this humdinger of a fight. But people who forget anniversaries, Matthew, are not necessarily narcissistic. I think that's the key here, is that just because someone's doing something that feels icky to you or hurtful to you, that doesn't always mean someone's narcissistic.
Yeah, I mean, I personally feel like we're setting the bar way too low for our relationships. The fact that that is revelatory what you're saying, but just the fact of even thinking about what are your values and your needs, and how do I reconstruct a standard for myself? Because you don't need to be in a narcissistic relationship to be in an extremely unhealthy, toxic relationship.
Nope.
And I think that both of those things, one is going to lead to probably a substantial amount more trauma than the other one.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that you should be staying in a relationship with someone that's extremely unhealthy and toxic to begin with. And so if your starting point is, what are my values? What are the needs? What are the standards I'm going to set to myself? You're not going to accept when someone's treating you like a particular way up front.
Right. But that goes into a deeper issue, which is the sense of, do I deserve this? Who do I think? Don't you know who I am? It's like, who the hell do I think I am to hold out for this? And things earlier in life, including the presence of narcissism or other antagonistic patterns in the family of origin, trauma in a family of origin, those kinds of things can be the takeoff ramp to the belief that in adulthood, you don't even have that orientation. We don't ever do that. We don't do that in high school. We don't do that in university. We don't sit down and talk about these things. And by the time someone's in a therapist's office, it's triage. Right? This isn't where somebody's learning how to stretch their hamstring. This is where we're bandaging the said hamstring, right? This is where somebody's already been hurt. When I'm fortunate and I get to work with a client for a long time, and we've done the recovery work out of relational trauma, typically in my work, it would be a narcissistic relationship. If someone has the means and wants to stick around, then we start doing the capacity building for new relationships. This is where we can really kind of hone into that. It's fascinating to watch a 65-year-old person for the first time say, I have no idea what the answers to those questions are, because relationships have always been survivalist spaces, right? You're saying, what do I pack if it's the end of the world? I can do that. But you're saying, what should I pack for like a long, meaningful retreat where I can think about myself? I have no idea. They're like, I need an axe. I'm like, no, we do not need a psychological axe for a relationship. But that's how people have not thought about this. But that's where I'm saying is that the setup though for the narcissistic relationship is, it's that the dichotomous nature of these relationships. These are people who often on the forward-facing side, who have narcissistic personalities, present as very successful, engaging, interesting, smart, charming, charismatic, engaging, all the things, right? And behind closed doors, there's a second repertoire of invalidation, disrespect, manipulation, gaslighting. So the world is still seeing that kind of forward-facing person. Or even if it's a more malignant narcissistic person who's controlling and cruel, the world then still might see someone who's sort of on top of their game. And there's a lot of excuses written about that. So narcissistic relationships represent a really, really sort of cruel space, because that dichotomy, it's not like a person who's in a relationship with someone, even with addiction, where everyone's very clear. That person's living with addiction. I bet it's not an easy relationship. The vast majority of people in narcissistic relationships, the world has no sense of how bad it is for people who are the closest into the center.
If you take somebody who's just maybe in an unhealthy, it's so important that you pointed that out about someone's sense of self, because there's so many things that construct a sense of self, and you can't disconnect someone's past and their childhood and what they experienced in their home from their own sense of value and their sense of self-worth. And so inevitably from that place, they might find themselves in an unhealthy type of relationship because of that. But do you think that there's a risk of maybe even hyper-vigilance? Let's just say the relationship's not going well. And so you start, narcissists are famously self-centered. So, going back to forgetting an anniversary or just forgetting to ask about your day, do you think there's a tendency or risk in our culture now of hypervigilance, of like putting someone on like a narc list, for example, of like, okay, that behavior, I'm gonna in there, and then it just kind of like explodes out at some point of like, you've had these 7 behaviors and now you're a narcissist.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the gotcha moment, right? And I understand what you're saying is like, okay, I'm watching, like, okay. And this is why I actually hate the red flags conversation.
Yeah.
Because I think what the red flags conversation does to us is it does put us in the gotcha seat. Matt Hussey, who's a dating expert, is a dear friend of mine. And he and I had this conversation once, and he really put it wisely. He said, when I'm trying to help people get into relationships, him and I are in complete agreement. Making it about red flags now means we've kind of taken people out of their best selves and turn them into their vigilant selves, which isn't exactly the best position in which to fall in love. But people are so worried about getting played. Like, everyone's talking about narcissism. I don't want to be the one who's played. It's because looking for patterns is much harder than looking for events. Right? Because you kind of got to pay attention and you got to watch things happen over time. You also have to listen to your body, because that's usually where we encode a lot of this, especially if it's happened to us before and something doesn't feel good, but we don't quite know how to be with that. And really the ultimate sort of palliative in these relationships is to slow down, to pay attention if something doesn't always feel great. And it's hard to do because it's like a ball rolling down a hill when you're in a new relationship. And so there is that sense of that vigilance, I think, has become part of dating speak, because as people are waiting longer and longer to get into committed relationships, there wasn't once the societal pressure, I'm 22, I've got to be in a relationship kind of thing. And there's more choice, and choice is always a paradox, right? Because it can also lead to more problems. People are so worried about like, well, what about this? And then they did do this and they said this. And it's a lot of gotcha-ing. By and large, though, I have to say what I see with narcissistic relationships is something quite different happens. Narcissistic relationships are unique in the narcissistic person's capacity for things like mirroring, the ability to be so razor attuned to someone that they learn everything about you, your vulnerabilities, your interests, your core wounds. It's like CIA operative kind of stuff. Like, they are on you. And that all gets remembered and put away, and it comes back. Things like, oh gosh, here we go. Yes, no. Oh gosh, here we go. Yep. No, I remember your mother and your father and your sister and that. chaotic, crazy family. So now the vulnerable story you told about your family
weaponized, yeah.
is now a weapon, right? And so there is, in many ways, these relationships feel like they're deeply intimate to start because somebody is so attuned as part of this data mining, mirroring process. The narcissistic person is sort of chasing, like, how do they like this and how do they want that? So they're becoming what that person wants. And in fact, Craig Malkin calls this echoism. Like, it's this, you're hearing back what you want to hear. And so it's not your standard issue, off the shelf, unhealthy relationship. This is something a bit more sinister. That's why it's a lot harder to get out of.
Yeah, I mentioned, I think you'll find this example interesting. I found this on Reddit. There's, about the idea of a narcissist potentially hijacking the narcissism language. And so there's a story I came across. This guy wrote, one man, my wife is convinced I have NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, even though 4 mental health professionals who I've seen as a patient confirmed to me that I do not. I have some traits of narcissism tops, but my wife does not seek professional help nor therapy. My wife does not talk to family nor friends. She has entered the narcissism echo chamber. Anyone with a good suggestion on how to get her back from what I feel is brainwashing, I think she should find a therapist instead. I feel like I'm losing my wife to a cult. And okay, so we can't confirm the truth of that story, but let's just say
sure,
it's an archetype. It's an archetype. He also could be seeking validation, but and minimizing his own behavior. But let's assume this story is true. At what point does like self-protection turn into some sort of projection on the other person? I felt bad for the guy if that's actually true. I'm like, 4 mental health professionals, 4 people be like, no, you're not a narcissist, but yet she seems to potentially have done the gray rocking thing of just completely cutting off him from the story. So I don't know.
So a couple of things. Number one is there are narcissistic relationships where both people are narcissistic. There are narcissistic relationships where the person who is the narcissistic one has completely almost infiltrated the spaces that are sort of trying to help the people who are going through these relationships, right?
Yeah.
And it's a way for them to offload any responsibility for their behavior. In fact, I'm developing a training on exactly this issue, training therapists on how to work with clients where the client coming into your room is the antagonistic client accusing someone else of being antagonistic. It's one of the most of tricky clinical spaces because you still want to hold that validating space, but in about 3 or 4 weeks you recognize like, oh God. And then how do I, and usually in many cases the client will get enraged at the therapist. Now here you've got an interesting issue. The partner won't even go seek therapy, right? That's problematic. And usually what we'll see is in people who are in antagonistic relationships, the antagonistic partner often is resistant to therapy or will go once or twice, or they themselves will become sort of therapy hounds and say, oh, I got all the answers, right? So again, we're assuming what he's saying is right. What does somebody say to him? I understand what he feels. I feel for this. If again, we're assuming he's telling the truth. I feel for him because if you want to go down this track, you can definitely find the space that will say, because the way I approach this work is, I'm going to educate a person about narcissism. Like, got it? Okay, now let's put that aside. The work's on you now. Because his wife should be the one, because her entire structure is, I'm going to make everything in my life about his narcissism. So that's not growth. The work is for the person in the narcissistic relationship to individuate, develop autonomy, trust, all that. Her entire gambit is on that. So honestly, I would tell this guy and say, listen, you have a strong idea about me that is simply untrue. And this doesn't feel good to me. And to the degree he cares about her and wants what's good for her, this is exactly the kind of couple I'd say, if you can even live in separate places for a minute and say to her, I just want what will help you grow as a person. Let's just cool it off for a while and go find that for yourself because I love you, I care about you. Because they're both, the one mistake human beings make across all situations, even narcissism not being the only one, is they try to convince other people of things, right? That's the mistake. He's trying to convince her He's not narcissistic. She's trying to convince him he is narcissistic. And that's when this work goes absolutely nowhere. It's not about convincing the other party. It's about being able to say, I don't feel psychologically safe in this relationship. I can't show up as myself in this relationship. I can't communicate in this relationship. That you recognize that this is what's happening. You do a few runs at the tiger's cage. You're like, okay, this isn't working. This door is not working. This door is not working. You go to therapy, you journal, you're like, okay, this is clearly a pattern. And then you ask yourself, how do I proceed if this isn't going to change? But I feel for him. And that echo chamber he talks about it's a chamber I try to make more of an accountability chamber than an echo chamber. But I fully understand where he's coming from. And it's a really, really tough balancing act.
Yeah, I mean, and you could tell me what you think about this. I mean, I see the situation, there can only really be three possibilities, right? She's either a narcissist that is weaponizing that language.
Correct.
Number two would be she's genuinely confused about what a narcissist actually is.
Yep.
Or, and I think maybe this is becoming more common, there's a self-righteousness of kind of what you were saying of, I don't want to look at myself or any sort of behavior in the relationship, and so I'm going to then put everything on him. And you were talking about growth. And so what do you feel like is happening there? Because I feel like it might help a listener to locate themselves in their own relationship, because in an unhealthy relationship, it requires two people taking accountability, to use your language, of themselves.
Right.
And that's very difficult. You could take accountability of yourself, but if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, I mean, it's a whole nother type of thing, you know?
Right. So, but I would almost say you've given 2.5 options, because I think that third option, that projecting onto someone else, that's sort of still, narcissistic people rely heavily on projection, which is a primitive defense of like, I'm not these things, you're these things kind of thing. When that's where I'm saying that it really comes back potentially to this person's antagonism. There's also another option here, and this is one that's becoming, again, it's a very delicate conversation and probably not one that's ideally had in online spaces, but it's here, and so we have to have it, which is other forms of mental health issues and neurodivergences that can show up as antagonism and narcissism. There is a woman I was recently talking with who's an expert in this area named Corey Abrams, and I really, really appreciated the conversation because the big place where it's coming in is with people who are autistic. Now, I was talking with somebody recently, and it was a very, very interesting, conversation. After I'd met with Corey, then I was talking to this other person and talking about a relationship where they said, I have a spouse who's actually really great sometimes, like really great. Like I really enjoy them and they're smart and we love hiking and we have some hobbies, like some actually rather peculiar hobbies, but they really both loved it together. And she said, and when it's bad, this is a person who is so controlling. Yeah. It has to be absolutely his way. And if I criticize him at those times, he gets really dysregulated and loses it. The thing where I was getting stuck on was like the almost 65 to 70% of how good it is. That's that's off ratio for a narcissistic relationship. They'd been together for almost like 35, 40 years. And she said, I've had it. I know this is a narcissistic person. But what she was talking about is her relationship was actually quite well regulated, quite nice, quite good. This person was definitely not imperious, arrogant, particularly entitled, was not interested in power and domination. But definitely at certain times, if it was almost like ants in a line, if the line went off, this partner could not tolerate it. And when she would say, give me that back, don't try to fix it that way, he'd lose it. That looked like escalated narcissistic rage, that looked like impulsivity, that looked like entitlement. But I would be willing to bet the farm that there's probably some neurodivergent stuff that's operating there. In which case, there's a lot more that could be done therapeutically. There's a lot more, when we're working with autistic clients, there's a lot more that can be done around, again, nervous system regulation and all that cannot be done in the same way with someone who's narcissistic. So if you tell a person who's narcissistic, hey, there's certain things that when that happens, you get really dysregulated, and we can give you some tools to regulate at those times. The autistic person will be like, give them to me, because I don't want to upset this person. The narcissistic person is going to say, F you and the horse you came in on. How dare you tell me that? You see what I'm saying? So right there, we get some very different data. And I've worked with more than a few people where it was that there was a motivation. And so, but a lot of therapists want to quickly go to this. And I'm like, we have to let this explanation breathe. Now, where it gets tricky is when we have both. And then we are now in a situation where it happens and happens more than you think. That's a very complicated situation because you've got this, you've got
So
this,
many
you've
different
got empathy
things.
for some of the autistic reactions. You have no empathy for this. And so there's a lot happening. I can count on one hand the number of therapists who could handle that situation. Well, I don't even think I'm one of them, to be frank with you, because I'm not as strong in the behavioral approaches meant to sort of handle some of the regulatory stuff in autism.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is a good time. I mean, we haven't properly defined what narcissism is in this conversation. So, and you kind of reclaim this in the book. So can you explain what narcissism is? And then you gave another word for it, which I think is really good. Yeah.
Narcissism is a personality style. Now, by definition, it's considered to be a maladaptive personality style because it impedes healthy relationships with other people, okay? An adaptive personality style could be something like healthy conscientiousness or agreeableness, but even those in excess can be a problem. But by and large, narcissism is a maladaptive personality style, and as part of its maladaptiveness, it's much more rigid. So it's less changeable. Narcissism is comprised of some very fundamental patterns. We see it's not a lack of empathy; it's low empathy. Lack of empathy implies an absence of empathy, like we'd see in psychopathy. It's not the case in a narcissistic person. The empathy is low. It tends to be cognitive, not emotional. It tends to be transactional, and it tends to be performative. So it's more of a hollow empathy when it's there. There is grandiosity and entitlement, a sense that I am more special than anyone else, I am exceptional, and I do deserve special treatment, and anger when that special treatment is not given or the rules are applied to the narcissistic person. There's pathological selfishness and absolute self-centeredness combined with the low empathy is absolute disconnect from how other people are feeling or how even the narcissistic person is affecting other people. There is an excessive need for admiration and validation. So there has to be almost constant faucets of praise turned on. And anything that feels like it's not enough praise is often met with anger, withdrawal, withholding, rage, all of that stuff. There is challenges with emotional regulation. Most commonly when that specialness is not recognized, we'll see dysregulated anger that can look like rage. It could look like passive aggression. It could look like withholding, withdrawing, abandonment, that sort of thing. That's the forward-facing stuff on narcissism. And all of those are defenses meant to protect the inner core of the narcissistic person, which is characterized by insecurity, ego, fragility, and above all else, shame. This constant sense that the world will see that they're not perfect, that the 4-year-old boy who ties the Superman cape around his neck to feel grand, it's the 44-year-old man still doing that. And if someone pulls that Superman cape off, then they will be bared to the world. So anything that sort of scratches the patina of the narcissistic person, a critique, their friend has a nicer car, they don't get enough social media likes, someone flirts with their partner, whatever it is, they get rejected. That is met with this really disproportionate anger. And so that's what narcissism is. It comes in a few different forms. There's classical grandiose narcissism. There's vulnerable narcissism that's more victimized, resentful, sullen. There's malignant narcissism, which is much more exploitative, coercive. So it comes in these different flavors, and it's on a continuum. Mild narcissism, I don't know that I'd even call it traumatizing in a relationship. I think it's annoying. It's frustrating. It's hard to raise a child with someone who's still wanting to play video games all night, and you got 3 little kids running around and dinner's not on the table. That's frustrating for the partner. Does it feel manipulative? It feels a little bit Carlos-y, right? And maybe at best, Carlos might be on that mild scale. But at the severe end, we are talking about really frightening, malignant, manipulative, harmful, sometimes even physically abusive relationship. Those two things don't look the same, but the core is operating the same. And so that's what narcissism is. The term I use, especially when I'm communicating with or teaching therapists, is antagonism, which is a higher order trait, like an umbrella trait over narcissism. Other things fall under the antagonism umbrella, like psychopathy is a great example. It's something called antisocial personality disorder. So it's antagonism, it's the behaviors that put people at odds with other people. It's hostility, it's manipulativeness, it's the entitlement, it's the arrogance. It's all that stuff that, again, it makes for very uncomfortable relationships. And using that higher order term really captures the stuff that makes narcissism so difficult in relationships. But what none of the diagnostic manuals do well is capture that other part, the charm, the charisma, the leadership orientation, and that's what's confusing everybody. They're like, they just talk a big game. But I'm like, they talk a big game and they may very well hurt you.
Now, is it true that everybody in society has, like, if you think about it as a scale, has a little bit of narcissistic
I don't
traits in
agree
them?
with that.
No?
I don't agree. I'll tell you why, because remember, I think everybody in society might have some people, more than a little bit of selfishness. Some people don't always have great empathy. There's people out there who do need a little bit of attention. But you got to have it all for it to be called narcissism.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So I don't think that's everybody. I think most people out there have intact empathy, don't believe they're more special. All of us get a little annoyed when the airline tells us for the 7th time there's a delay, but in fact, the plane was never coming in the first place. But it's everybody, right? So people say, I was entitled because I was kind of rude to the flight attendant. I'm like, oh, no. Let me tell you what entitled looks like. It's not this. So I think that we can all have our moments. But I also think that most of us repair in those moments. And as a rule, narcissistic people don't repair. They double down. I'm not doing anything wrong. This is your fault. So the dynamics that emerge here are things like blame shifting, betrayal, all of that. That stuff all goes along with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Your second book, our modern life and our culture is it's celebrating some of the type of traits of narcissism. I think there's just so many things with social media and our current landscape and public figures and whatnot that this inflated sense of importance. I don't know if you can speak to that, but just like how that then feeds people's behaviors in a validating way.
So when you say the inflated sense of importance that we're just seeing sort of in people in general in the world, or the people who are the leadership in the world?
Well, both. I mean, I think that the kind of landscape that we're in is like you see examples of maybe egocentric people, and then also, going back to the example I was talking about with Uber founder, like you might celebrate someone that in like a godlike type fashion, and so if someone's narcissistic, it's almost like revving that up if someone's like patting their back, and so then when you turn into a relationship dynamic with that person. It's like everybody else is kind of celebrating how great they are, and yet then you're at home with them and get to see like the ugly lashing out. So I don't know. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on in terms of the way that culture might be influencing some of that stuff.
We're in an interesting era of the genius, especially because of tech, right? The innovations that have come so fast are predicated on a skill set not everyone has, writing code and sort of decoding what this whole sort of new kind of tech world is. So when people are able to do things like, I can use my phone to call a stranger to come pick me up at my house, or I get food right away, or whatever it is, I've got a computer in my pocket kind of thing. There is an awe. There's even an admiration. I think that the problem is that we are assuming that there is all these other wonderful traits. Like it's like a halo effect. Oh, if you can develop an app, then you must be a nice guy. I'm like, no, they can develop an app. Like full stop. That's the end of the sentence. The rest of it you have to plumb the depths of that person. And the odds are not in your favor on this one, right? Because in some ways, that sort of single-minded pursuit of success sometimes means that some of that other stuff that's affiliative and collaborative and compassionate, it falls by the wayside.
And they might have a good publicist.
And they may have a very good publicist. But we are right now caught up in the cult of genius. And so that's fine. Thanks, genius, for giving me a computer in my pocket. I don't want to have dinner with you. And I think people sort of need to understand that what to look for, what matters in a close relationship may not always reproduce in that other space. But because of how the stories are being told in society, because of how these folks are being emboldened, that we have I mean, we read what we're given, even though we're in silos, even though we keep being given more and more to read than what we already read. We don't even get to read the dissenting point of view. Is that we're believing that virtue begets virtue, like intellect. I tell clients all the time, and groups of people I speak to, being smart is not a virtue. Being smart is being smart, right? Being able to program an app is being able to program an app. Being able to write some fantastic genius book of our time is being able to write and think. It doesn't necessarily mean that they can love and they can care.
Yeah,
and
so good.
we are confusing that. And that, until people can see that difference, that halo doesn't follow everything they do.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that Ellen Langer was on here. I mean, the whole idea of mindfulness, I mean, she said the exact same thing, especially when it comes to comparison and envy and all of these traits in our culture. Like, we look at these people and we don't mindfully think about all the different things that they might not be in that moment. And so I think this is a good part in the conversation of people need a map. Like, even if that terminology evolves and we start saying antagonistic instead of narcissistic, and because at the end of the day, I think, like I was saying before, just accepting narcissistic behavior should not be our cutoff. Like, our standards should be far higher than that. So if you were to give people a North Star, what do you think a healthy relationship looks like? Emotionally, psychologically, relationally? What would your starting point for that be?
Psychological safety.
Yeah.
It's a place where you can show up as you and be vulnerable. And it doesn't mean the other person's going to agree, but that you're not going to be shut down, that you're not going to be told you are wrong, all of your mere existence, how you are, that it is where you can take a chance with an idea and share it. And even if the other person's like, I don't think I agree with that, but still feel held. That, I mean, again, I can't put a fine enough point on the psychological safety. I wish I could say my starter here is love, but I don't even think we operationalize love well. But it is that sense of safety. I can come in, I can be Ramani, and that's okay. All the things that Ramani is, from cat loving to blackjack loving to won't watch scary movies, Ramani, and somebody is, and I can say that, and I don't have to feel scared if I'm rejected, and if I am rejected, to know that it's okay to leave. I don't have to fight. Because for a lot of people, love is about fighting to be seen instead of you don't see me. I bear you no ill will, but this isn't a safe place for me to hang my hat. But rather, I'm going to fight, and I'm going to show you why, because that's what a lot of people had to do with their parents. And so breaking people out of it's okay. You'll find people who will get you, who will see you, who will care for you. But all of that is psychological safety. And from there, it's that issue of values. What are your values? What do you value? Again, it's different things for different people. Some people value aesthetic. Like, they care about what things look like. They care about art. They care about music. That's a meaningful value. And so that we sometimes don't do that deep dive into ourselves. And to understand that in a relationship, our values aren't identical. In fact, it's kind of fun when they're not exactly the same, but that there's a willingness for the other person to hold space for that, for both sets of your values.
Yeah.
It's the and of it all. Again, my daughter does improv, and I've learned wisely from her. It's the but and, right? The old improv trick. You do but, it's over. It's the and is where the multiple truths sit. I am this, and I care about you, and we do not agree about politics, and I don't think pineapple should be on a pizza, and I don't want a dog, and all of those things have to happen, and you have to say and when it comes to narcissistic relationships, and is even more powerful. I've met a person, and we built a family, and they treat me really cruelly. That's a really hard sentence to say with an and. And once you say it with an and, because Matthew, I will never sit here. I'm very agnostic to whether people stay or leave a relationship. The only thing that I say drives leaving a relationship is physical violence. You or other, dependent adults or children are in harm's way. That's a whole different game. But assuming that we're remaining in the realm of emotional abuse, not a good thing. But I never say anyone should leave. You're going to get to where you get to with that for all the reasons, culture and practical and all the reasons. But I say the only thing I ask, you're going to stay, you got to use your ands. Because when you use the ands, it doesn't mean like, and, well, I'm going to go. It's and I am not to blame. If it's I'm in a relationship and we have a family and they treat me cruelly, that's different than I'm in a relationship with someone, but they treat me badly, because what tends to come after that could be my fault too. And so it's that understanding that somebody is being cruel and it's not okay.
No, that's such an important distinction. There was this concept I thought was brilliant that you were talking about with love bombing in the beginning of a relationship. And I think that your blinders start to go up to a lot of that downstream stuff when you're already in a relationship, because a lot of the beginning of our relationship in our culture is it's so, we have so much chemistry and it's so like, in fact, they're so like pursuing after me and they love me so much. And so we confuse that as a healthy core to the beginning of a relationship. So can you explain like what love bombing is and why it's like deceptive to this entire situation?
Yeah. I mean, I think love bombing is something that's kind of gotten twisted in the sort of internet landscape, because I think by and large, people have thought of love bombing as extravagant first dates and going on a vacation on your third date and roses and gifts and all that fancy stuff. It can be. But what love bombing is it's almost like the perfect attunement. And that a perfect attunement could be someone says exactly what you've always wanted to hear. It's almost as though they're so attuned to you that they're giving you exactly what you want. And for a lot of people, that is unrelenting pursuit. Ambiguity at the beginning of a relationship is very, very stressful for people. Are they going to call back? Do they like me? Could you help decode this text? When there's no question that someone's into you, there's few reliefs greater. Like, this person's clearly into me. Now, some people might even feel like, ooh, I can have some fun with this because I'm actually secure that they're into me. But that's the fantasy. Again, these fantasies tend to be ancient. If anyone grew up with any of that sense of ambivalence, like, is my parent even noticing me? All that other stuff, that sense of knowing that this person is all in is a real anxiety lifter. So love bombing can even be just sort of the loss of ambiguity, just because that you're just sort of being pursued relentlessly. There's the good morning text, there's the good night text. I can't stop thinking about you. I've never felt like this good about anyone before. It feels great. Right? And so now what's happening is almost like this dopaminergic imprinting onto this person, like all these great neurotransmitters and neurohormones are flowing, and they're all fixated on this person's sort of like picture on the top of their name and all of that on your phone. It becomes really powerful. That's what love bombing is. It's often, to me, it's less about the gifts and the grandiosity, and it's more about core wounds getting bandaged really quickly.
How would you, if someone is single, how would you coach that person through that they would be in a healthy place to even navigate that type of situation? Like, are there markers that you feel like someone needs to be? Because again, so much of this is tied to what you were talking about earlier, our childhood experiences, our sense of self, the treatment. So if someone starts, quote unquote, love bombing you, and you're like, oh my God, I feel so good. I feel so valued. And the only reason why you feel valued is because someone else now is opposing value on you because you felt worthless before. And so do you feel like there are some internal things maybe that need to be worked out before someone's like, I'm in a healthy place to date?
So I'm going to go a little backwards on this. Like, let's just assume someone's come out of a toxic relationship, and like, I'm going to tell everyone, like, just as my public health announcement on your podcast episode, if you've come out of a really emotionally abusive or unhealthy relationship, promise me a year down without dating. Because I think, and everyone's like, what are you kidding me, Dr. Ramani? A year? I'm like, ooh, a year where every anniversary date can be rewritten, and the birthdays and the seasons and all the things. A year is actually a really nice healing. I think there's a reason the planet, the planet going around the sun. It's just that there's something about it, right? So give yourself that. Do the self-study first. All the things I'm saying. Who are you? What are you about? What do you stand for? What are your values like? So you know what those things are. Have routines that matter to you. You've got that friend group you get together with on Thursday nights and do your wacky book club or something. Don't budge too much on that, because I think that sense of a relationship means I sort of cut my ties and I go all in. That's where stuff can get precarious. So have the things that matter to you, because what they say, once you've signed the deal, you can't negotiate backwards, right? You've got to remember what in your life matters so you can hold on to that. Clean psychological house, like getting into therapy before things may be necessarily always bad, just to say, I want to, even if it's 3 or 4 sessions with someone, like I'm dating, I just want to make sure I've sort of talked some stuff out. We always think of therapy as sort of a response to something going wrong. It can also be like a safe, confidential space where you can unpack some stuff so you can think about that before you get into a relationship. And then above all else, let's say, take it slow. Any toxic relationship gets most of its advantage by playing fast forward, because the faster something moves, the less you can process. So when a relationship is moving too quickly, I want to see you Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Let's go spend 4 days together. Let's do this together. Let's do that together. Let's move in together after 2 or 3 months. Do relationships sometimes come together really fast and furious and last? Sure. I think I was just talking to someone the other day. They said they after 2 months they got married or something like that. And they've been married for like 1,000,000 years or something like that. Yay for you. And you know what? Someone bought a Powerball ticket at a liquor store near me and they won $10 million. Okay. So great for both of them. You're not going to win the Powerball, and you're probably not going to stay with the person you rushed into marriage with. Slow it down. Even trauma healing and trauma processing happens when we slow down. Mindfulness happens when we slow down. And I'm a big believer in mindful dating. Take the time, let the date settle, sit with it. And then, I have to be frank with you, Matthew, one of the greatest ways you can learn in a new relationship is if you say to someone, they're like, let's get together on Sunday. And you're like, you know what? I had such a good time last night. I already had a plan with a friend, tonight I'm going to see you for dinner. I'd love to see you next week. If you're going out with that friend is enough for them to say, well, I guess you're not that into me. That's hitting the 16. Like they're just trying to keep this going. Or if you hear something like, well, I thought you really were into something committed, and I go, you seem like you're on the fence, when all you're doing is saying something like, there's something that matters to me that I want to do. But it's at that juncture where people waver. They're like, I don't like this person. I don't want to lose them over I could see Mary anytime. I'm like, no, this isn't about Mary. This is about what happens when you're making a very simple need known in this relationship. It's one thing if they're leaving for 6 months on Monday. It's a different conversation. But if they could see you on a different day and they're like, well, I guess you're not that committed, or I thought you were really into me. That's a manipulation. And some of these little signs are there for you to sit with. And none of this is a science. I always tell folks who've really been through some emotionally abusive or antagonistic relationships, something like this may very well happen to you again. The difference is you're going to pick up on it quicker. And instead of it being 16 years, this time it may only be 6 months. And we're going to put that one in the win column.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful and such wise advice for people. I loved what you said earlier about the fact of not using the word red flags, but if someone is starting to date, what are maybe some green flags that people could look for, of like, oh, that was very nice behavior, and maybe would stand at odds as somebody that they wouldn't do that if they were,
asking a question, listening, and listening to your answer, and the conversation actually being a back and forth. I always say it's like a game of catch, right? Then no one's like trying to throw it at your head, or they're actually throwing it at you. They're not holding on to it, running away with it, not interrupting you. That's a big, green flag that they're actually, again, it's letting it breathe, listening. It's attunement, it's regulation. It's watch how they handle stress. I always say that's a real green flag. They don't get the parking spot they want. The table actually, even though you had a reservation, is a 45-minute wait. Do they start yelling at the person at the front of the restaurant? Do they get glum? Or do they say, well, what do you want? I know you're really hungry. I mean, there's a fast food place down the street. You want to go grab a burger before you have this? And you'd say, gosh, that's sort of sweet. Or they don't get mad or say, they say, let's just go get a drink at the bar, or let's go, it's a lovely neighborhood. Let's take a walk. Are they regulated in the face of frustration or disappointment? How do they handle things like traffic? How do they value your time? How do they communicate? Do they take responsibility, or are they accountable? If they say, I am so sorry, I didn't time this right. I knew I was working till 7. I told you I'd meet you at 8. I am running late. This was so disrespectful of your time. They come when they come, and they don't do it again. Or you see corrections in behavior. So they'll say, I timed that too tight. Next time, let's just do 8:45. I know I could get there then. So you can see that there's an awareness of their schedule, their work schedule, your time. How do they talk about past relationships? Listen, some of us have been through some icky stuff, and all we want to do is say, well, you're a lot better than the last one. But are they saying disparaging things? Are they saying lots of disparaging things about lots of people? That's something to pay attention to. There's an antagonistic vibe to that.
Yeah.
So just listen to that, those signals as well. And are they curious about all aspects of your life? Are they asking about your, what matters to you and not rolling their eyes at it? Do you feel like they can put their device down and actually pay attention to you? There's such tiny, tiny, tiny little tells. And even with all of these, can someone antagonistic still, crawl through the net? Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. These are patterns over the long term, but you really are. I think if I were to say one word, I would say genuine attunement, not performative attunement, but genuine attunement.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most shocking parts of looking into your work was, is it really true that a lot of people can't identify that they're in a relationship with a narcissist until like a year?
Yeah.
How does that come into play?
Because it's a pattern, and it's not. I mean, remember, think about it. I would say for a lot of narcissistic relationships, for anywhere from 4 weeks to 6 months, you've got someone who's actually on their very best behavior. Okay. And if things are going well in that person's life, work's going the way they want, they're making the salary they want, whatever it is, things are the way they want it to be, that stretch can go even longer. The newness of a relationship, new sex, new places you're going together, it's all very shiny, right? It's a holiday morning and you're opening all kinds of new packages with someone. It's exciting. And this is where the narcissistic person's on their A game. But there's also something else happening. As we fall in love with someone, we just project good onto them. So even when they're having a little bit of a grumpy day, we might take they got a really busy, big job, or they didn't mean that, or we had such a great time last night. So we're already doing a lot of justifying, sometimes in a reasonable way, but sometimes that starts becoming the language of the relationship. We're always justifying the bad behavior because we're enjoying so much of it. And because we're justifying their bad behavior, we're missing it as a pattern. We're like, they worked late. They've got a competitive job. They had a tough father. They had a bad ex-girlfriend. And so before you know it, we've created the mental model that lets them get away with stuff. So the signs might be there. But I think people, and again, patterns need time to accumulate. Like I said, we can't generalize from one event. So it can take a minute before we start to say, wait a minute, like that's just... For a year, we've been struggling with this. Because after a year, you might say, this is a long time that this is still a problem. Or we wait for things to repeat, right? Once isn't enough, twice isn't enough. Maybe by 3, 4, 10 times, we're like, this is an issue. Well, it might take almost a year for that much to accumulate.
Why do you feel like people stay in abusive relationships? Big question.
So many reasons. It's a big reason. Big question. I would say one of the classical reasons people stay in abusive relationships relates to, let's go back to the casino, shall we, to something called intermittent reinforcement that goes to something called trauma bonding. It's the reason people play slot machines. Nobody plays a slot machine to win $10. You're playing a slot machine to win jackpot. And the way the slot machine keeps you engaged, if it took your first 100 coins you put in, you would have walked away. That's boring. But it keeps spitting stuff back out at you. $1 becomes $5. Woo, becomes $10. Woo, dollar in, dollar out. Dollar in, dollar out. Ooh, something like 25. Wow, that's kind of exciting. Jackpot seems possible. But in between all of that, there's lots of dollars that just go away. That's intermittent reinforcement. It's the toughest behavioral reinforcement cycle to walk away from, right? If everything's set, if I do this, I get, every time I go to Subway and I get a sandwich or something, I get a little stamp. That's interesting up to a point, or frequent flyer mile or something like that. But this is a different game. Trauma bonding is predicated on the idea that unhealthy relationships represent a vacillation of really good days and really bad days. And that backing and forthing, where a bad day is almost like a sense of, well, it's going to turn around. It always does. And it's kind of exciting, like we know it's going to turn around. And the good days are sort of this tension of, when is this going to go wrong? In that cycle, there's a lot of self-blame, a lot of, maybe this was my fault. I didn't say this the right way. So the sense of personal culpability is why people stay in harmful relationships. But then there are practical issues too. A year into a relationship, you might be engaged to be married. You might even have a child on the way. You might have gotten married. You may be sharing a home. There may be financial interdependence.
Yeah.
You may have moved far away to be with them. There's some real buy-in at that point. And that can create some sunk cost fallacy as well. But that is still nothing compared to sort of this intermittent sense of, it's going to get better, and if it doesn't, it's my fault. There's, again, that personal culpability. So the person in the harmful relationship, especially when it's not physically harmful, will do everything they can. They'll read the books, they'll go to therapy, they'll try harder, they'll communicate this way, then they'll communicate that way. They'll twist, they'll turn, they'll try this strategy.
Good intention, yeah.
It's a good intention because there's things there they like. I'm attracted to them. They're great in bed. We have so much fun. They're so smart. They have a good job. My parents like them. My friends like them. We both like fishing. On and on. We both love dogs. The dogs love them. The list goes on for what people can find. And good old familiarity. I mean, that's probably the most seductive thing of all. We human beings are very homeostatic in our orientation. We like things to be the same.
Yeah, one of the most dangerous things I feel like, not just for a narcissistic relationship, but the rescuer kind of mentality. Yeah. We get into a relationship and we think that we're going to be the thing that just completely changes the way that somebody is. And I think that leads to a lot of hurt. I think if someone is going to fundamentally change as a human being, it's going to have to be on their own that they do that work. And again, it's like we'll take the 1 out of 50, 1 out of 100 type scenario where, oh, well, this person did it and then they just became a completely different person when we were together. And it'd be like you're going to put your hopes all in that because of a lot of stuff that you're saying. But that might just lead to like more trauma at the end of the day.
It does. Remember too, the fixing behavior, the rescuing behavior is often part of the larger, the larger sequelae of all trauma responses, of fight, flight, freeze, and above all else, fawn. Right. And the fawn response is a very common trauma response for people who are in relationally abusive households, especially narcissistically abusive households growing up. And then the fawn response can persist. And again, fawning isn't me actively complimenting you so I can get you to go to dinner with my friends on Saturday. Fawning is an involuntary reflexive response, as all trauma responses are, that is designed to keep me safe, right? So it's sort of a going along. It's a people pleasing. It's a rescuing. It's the doing. It's the child that is so desperately trying to be seen by the invalidating, unattuned parent that they're doing everything from they're parentified, they're running the household, they're doing all the things because that response is at least keeping them somewhat connected, and that whatever that sense of safety is for a child, well, that persists into adulthood. And that sort of doing in a relationship is not an uncommon kind of a situation, going back to that whole trauma bonded dynamic. People who are more agreeable, people who are more conscientious, they may lean more empathic, more compassionate. They're going to often lean more to that rescuing, to that doing, as it were, as the transaction, as the currency of the relationship. And that can be very gendered. I mean, for the longest time, that is what women were socialized to do in relationships, to rescue, it's literally, they were told that by women's magazines. And so I think that's very much a go-to for people. And in narcissistic relationships, because even the most grandiose narcissistic person has a vulnerable underbelly where they feel victimized and sullen and sad, and why isn't the world safe to me and fair to me, I should say. And even, especially if the narcissistic person is having failure to launch, they're trying something and nothing is kind of coming together. a rescuer partner, as it were, will want to get in there and say, no, let me help you. No, you're doing great. Let me introduce you to someone. I know someone who can help out. You know what? Take 6 months off. You can get this venture going. I'll get a second job. It's all these things that they're doing. And part of it is it's very active, but part of it is part of that fawn response.
What do you think someone should be prepared for if they find the courage to actually leave someone? What is it? Is there retribution that happens? What do they need to be emotionally prepared for if they get the courage to leave?
It depends on how severe the relationship is. Again, remember I said narcissism is on a continuum, and the behavior in these relationships is on a continuum. In the more severe, moderate to severe relationships, we can see what's called post-separation abuse. And that is vindictiveness, revenge, smear campaigns where the narcissistic person will reach out to people in their social circle and tell them things that may even be untrue, or at least things that shouldn't be shared about the relationship. In the worst scenarios, will tell their children things that shouldn't be shared about the relationship, or even potentially even lies about the other parent. There may be other reputational harms, reaching out to employers or talking to people that the person works with. They can really co-opt family court systems, engage in legal abuse, tech abuse, malware on computers and on phones and on devices. I mean, it really depends on how severe the situation is. Basically, you think you're going to leave me? No. And so it's very, narcissistic people are actually very rejection sensitive and very abandonment sensitive. Believe it or not, for all the bluff and bravado, there is a real sensitivity to abandonment for many narcissistic people. And so the blowback is often going to be this very much, this sort of scary, no one's ever going to talk to you again. The kids aren't going to talk to you. Our family, some people will say literally their own parents and siblings were converted over to the narcissistic person's side of the equation. That's if you decide to leave the narcissistic person. I always tell folks the best outcome is that the narcissistic person leaves you. But some people will say, I feel bad, like they've already met someone new and they're in a new relationship. And is this person got something I don't have? And I'm like, no, let him go. But that's easy for me to say. It's their broken heart. And you wonder, does this person have something else? So even for people who are left in these relationships, there can be a sense of, maybe they're going to change for this person. Maybe this person was better and I'm the one who's lacking. But if you're the one who's going to get up and leave, in milder narcissistic relationships, even still, you may see some sort of passive-aggressive zingers on social media. You might see some petty stuff around stuff they take from the house if you live together. But in the more severe presentations, it can actually be downright frightening. So fear-inducing that this is part of the reason some people don't leave. And that's why when people say, well, if it's so abusive, why don't you leave?
It's hard.
It's really hard.
Very difficult.
It's really, really hard.
I did want to go back to the narcissist don't change thing. And we've already established the rescuer mentality and how that is not a good mentality to have. I actually want to explore this question through the lens of a narcissist. So let's just say a narcissist is listening to this podcast right now, and they hear that about themselves, and it creates some sort of sense of hopelessness about the only reality of their future. Like, what would you say to that person if they genuinely have some sort of desire of like, some sort of wake up call, I don't want to be this way?
Then you can stop. Okay, so it's one of the big deficits we see in narcissism is a lack of self-reflective capacity, a lack of mentalization capacity, right? That ability to be able to say, oh, when I do this, I'm affecting someone else or I'm hurting someone else. The self-focus is so profound in a narcissistic person, they struggle with that sense of the other, right? If you show me someone who's narcissistic, who's hit whatever rock bottom they've hit, and they've said, I've blown everything up. My kids aren't talking to me. I've lost my marriage. My career is a shambles. The only thing that's in common in all these situations is me. I've got to do something. You're telling me I can't change? And I've worked with so many narcissistic clients over the years. So I've done tons of work on that side. What's challenging is that it's like a rubber band. In fact, I wish I could remember the person who came up with this rubber band theory of personality, right? We have a rubber band. We can take an elastic band and we can stretch it out, right? You can really, it's this small to start with and go all the way here, yeah? How long can it stay that stretched?
breaks?
Or as long as I keep my arms like this.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? What happens when I put the rubber band back on the table? It goes back to its original size. So one of the challenges is that some narcissistic, I think, forget narcissism, all personality styles can get pulled and stay in that position for a while, but back to baseline, we'll sometimes go back to that baseline. Well, in this case, the baseline is a problem. You said you recently had a guest. Dr. Langer was talking about mindfulness. With narcissism, it is a constant commitment to the awareness of the other. So a lot of the therapies that work well with narcissistic people are, for example, Dr. Wendy Behari's work on schema therapy shows promise to me. A lot of the work on mentalization can show promise, but it requires constant around-the-clock commitment, the willingness to be regulated, even using models like Dr. Marsha Linehan's dialectical behavior therapy as a way to manage sort of the dysregulated behavior we see. But all of this is predicated on the willingness of the narcissistic person to take responsibility and accountability for what they did in these relationships, that you can't just scream and yell. And listen, I've seen some interesting outcomes. I was reading an account of someone recently, very, very famous person. It was an article in the New York Times, super famous, like one of the best in the industry, the entertainment industry. And he had a real fall from grace because he had abused anybody who was working under him, throwing things and yelling and screaming. And so he had to step out of the game for a while. And like I said, this person was as successful as they come. And through therapy, he came to find out that what he was doing wasn't okay, right? And that he never stopped to consider, to him, success was the end game. And he never stopped to consider that, to him, he actually felt like those people were an acceptable sacrifice, and that people are not an acceptable sacrifice. He had to be taught that, and he still feels that excellence has a price, but through the therapy was basically able to be taught that other people can't be that price. Is he probably still a prickly guy? Yeah. I think that what you'll see is that the narcissistic person might learn some better regulation tools. They may be a bit precious about it. I need to go to my meditation room. Give me about 2 hours. I'm going to meditate this anger away. I'm like, homie, we don't have 2 hours. Like, you're going to do this we need like the 3-minute regulation technique. So it's a bit of that, but it's with long-term commitment. And I've got to tell you, I've worked with narcissistic clients who were cheating on their wives, and their wives were upset, and their mistresses are upset because they were cheating on the mistresses with another person. And I've had people come to me and say, I'm just leaving all these relationships because I now know I don't want to hurt anyone. This is not what I want to do, and I can't really do this. Like, this blah, blah, blah of the relationships doesn't work for me, but I don't want to hurt them. And so I remember one guy saying, I'm just not doing this, at least not for a long time. He ended up getting another relationship and made a mess of that. But it was a little bit more lighthearted mess than the deep messes he was making before. Some narcissistic folks will say after all the messes they made, they were at least able to come into accountability with their own adult children. And they felt like maybe that was all the win they could get. The adult children still have a lot of anger at them for the harm they did to their other parent, but they're able to land on a flatter slope with them. So I think I've had some really good outcomes with narcissistic clients, but they had access to good therapists, usually more than one, to see them multiple times a week. This is expensive. So your sort of average narcissistic person on the street is not going to have access to this kind of care. But the kind of vulnerability this work involves, it really is like the same way we talk about addiction rock bottoms. In some ways, it's what I call the narcissistic rock bottom. It's like everything has gone, and there is the first time the light comes on, and the person says, I am the person in the center of all of this. So I guess I do have to take some accountability, but I think we can look at the many news cycles we're in right now and look at some of the narcissistic people around us. And you ask me, do you really think those people can change?
I mean, I think that, I mean, you were talking about narcissism being a scale. I think it would depend where they're at on the scale and the severity. And I mean, I was doing all this work ahead of this interview, and I think it's interesting what actually produces a narcissist to begin with. I can't help but think about the role of potentially early childhood trauma or
Absolutely.
attachment or some
Yeah.
sort of thing that created this kind of like severe, where you're talking about personality disorder, but so I don't know. I think that there are just so many things that probably like are feeding that behavior, and maybe the protective mechanism is so strong. It's
Yes,
like
it
this
is.
force field
Yes, it
that
is.
is going on that like if they, I don't know if they actually got in touch with that stuff, like the explosion that would
be.
that would come out of them. And so it is amazing, the human experience of the things that could develop from adverse childhood experiences or attachments and all that
Absolutely.
stuff is just insane.
And that said, though, the rate of narcissism, and I don't talk about NPD. I want nothing to do with the diagnostic formulation. I think it moves the needle nowhere. It muddies the waters. Most people out there don't have this diagnosis, so let's just take it out of the conversation. Right?
Very small. Yeah.
So we're talking about 12% of the population, 10 to 12% of the population has enough narcissistic personality that we would notice it, that it would cause disruption in relationships, harm to others, right? Now, a lot of people were harmed in childhood. I've worked with people who are from family systems where there are 4 siblings. Now, Gabor Mate would argue that no matter how similar the circumstances are, every child in a family has a different childhood. And he's right, because experientially it is different. It's coming through that person's intrapsychic systems and central nervous system and all of that. I agree with that. But all things being equal, systemically, and all children were either subjected to similar traumas or, there was not significant trauma, but other kinds of disruptions in the environment. Whatever it may be, there's temperament. Temperament's the biological sort of sourdough starter of our personality, right? It's even in the little baby, you can see what temperament is. It's the one kid who just sort of calms down and soothes so easily. The other kid is like, rah, arms out. And, the one kid who's just dysregulated all the time and the other one who's just kind of calm. Some of that's predictive. I mean, there's some interesting research that shows that this temperamental stuff at 8 predicts what a person's going to be like as an adult. So we see some of that, but that temperament collides with the environment. A lot of this is, if it's not frank trauma, it's all these other things. It's attachment crises, it's chaos, it's invalidation. But the key, the big piece in all of this is that in family systems, in all my years doing this work, I've only run into one family system where every sibling was narcissistic. I mean, and that or the show Succession. That's the only other
Succession.
time I've seen every sibling is narcissistic.
Yeah.
But is one in real life family, every adult child in the family system is narcissistic. But in no other case have I ever seen that. And I've seen families where there was one very severely narcissistic sibling, 1 or 2 are struggling with other mental health issues, and one who actually emerged quite agreeable and resilient, right? So we also know even what results in resilience in a child who's had significant trauma exposure. Some of it is actually one protective adult. It can often be that simple, even if it's like a teacher or something like that who steps in, and if they can't even fully shield the child, gives them opportunity. But a lot of narcissistic people, in fact, I'd say almost, if not all, quite a few, in the sense of there is interesting work that came out of the Netherlands looking at the developmental arc of narcissism. And one of the thoughts is that these are kids who are just ultra overindulged. But so in essence, they're sort of an extension of the parent. My child's more special than any other. You, darling, are much more special. We're not waiting in line like them. You can go along with that, but I'm going to take care of this for you. So it's this really, it's like that movie Wicked, where the sort of the lighty, flitty pink princess or whatever the heck she was much more indulged and told she was perfect, right? And so that she was a much more sort of grandiosely, shallowly, kind of had a light narcissistic feel to her. That character was kind of carrying that, and kind of what's a modern trope, but the overindulged child. But one could argue that overindulgence, especially if there's not a lot of emotional validation behind that, is its own form of neglect.
Yeah.
The child is basically sort of an accessory for the parent, one more place for the parent to channel their entitlement and narcissism. I think that's its own form of abuse, because a child's not learning to be in the world. It's hurting them in their peer relationships. Most of those kids end up with imposter syndrome. Some of them become narcissistic. So mostly, if it's like a Plinko game and you drop all the little things, still only a few of the Plinko chips are going to narcissism. The vast majority of them are going to complex trauma, post-trauma, anxiety, depression, disorders of regulation, disordered eating, substance use, all of that. That's where all the other Plinko chips go. Just a few go to narcissism.
Yeah, I'd imagine almost entirely this thing is environmentally
It's all
conditioned.
environment. No child is. If you want to say the child's born narcissistic,
yeah.
all babies are narcissistic. I don't know if you've ever taken care of a baby. They don't care that you haven't slept. They don't care that you haven't eaten. They just scream. That feels very narcissistic, but they're a baby. That's what they're supposed to do. They fully rely on us. And that the lucky baby is kept safe and loved and attuned to. And even by about a year or so, they're kind of like, can't scream now. She seems to be eating. So like, I'm going to hold this one off for a minute. They already start picking up that there's an environment around them. By 3, they even know kind of right and wrong, like you can't take someone else's cookie off their plate. So they're quicker studies than the narcissistic folks. And some people argue that the narcissistic person is probably stuck somewhere between 3 and 4 years of age.
Yeah, when I think about your work, I mean, I can't help but think, it is so interconnected with like relational trauma.
It is. A lot of people would argue narcissistic abuse and relational trauma are one and the same.
Yeah, exactly. And so, and I think that's two-way. I mean, when we're talking about the forming or making of a narcissist, but then also on the other end, your work in the very real pain that these people have experienced on the other end, like the loss of self. I mean, you've talked about this so often, but what is the end result for that person from a trauma perspective of years and years and years of this?
A person who's been in a narcissistic relationship?
Yes, on the receiving end.
On the receiving end, back to severity, of course. The more severe, the poorer the outcomes. I'd say in a not insubstantial number of cases, people who've gone through this for years and years and years without escape have symptomatology that looks more consistent with complex post-trauma. So anyone who's inescapable relational trauma, the net result of that tends to look like complex trauma. What we're actually researching now in a large data set we're actually in the process of collecting is to find out that is when you get out of that most severe level of narcissistic abuse, like the real isolation, not being able to socialize as much with other people, constant emotional abuse, perhaps even some physical abuse. So when you're out of that severity of the narcissistic abuse, but you come down into more of this sort of, the world thinks they're a nice person, I'm constantly being invalidated. If I show up as my true self, I'm shut down, I'm gaslighted. That sort of more mid-range emotional abuse. What we're trying to determine is whether we're able to see that there's a phenomenon separate from complex trauma. And what that looks like, the most prominent features are things like confusion, anxiety, self-blame, self-doubt. Am I reading this right? I think it's something that's wrong with me. Lots of imposter syndrome, a sense that I don't belong here. I don't know what I'm talking about. Lots of regret, a fear of saying the wrong thing. There can be tremendous relational hyper-vigilance, relational arousal, like this hyper-alertness when they're in new relational settings or even in other relational settings, a sense of loneliness and isolation. Maybe I'm the only one going through this. Maybe this is my problem. Other people seem to like them. So what you have is, again, it's a real landscape of anxiety, self-doubt, and vigilance. Not quite the hypervigilance we'd see in post-trauma, but akin to this sort of, it almost looks like a severe social anxiety. I've got to say this the right way. I have to do this right way. Oh gosh, did I say this wrong? Did I get this wrong? It's that kind of thing. But one thing we do notice in a lot of survivors of narcissistic relationships, and it's sort of an interesting thing, they actually are able to navigate other relationships well, friendships, workplace even. The kids are well taken care of. So we don't tend to see the same kinds of sometimes social impairments and occupational impairments we might see, for example, in a mental health issue like depression. So the person in the narcissistic relationship will often say, you know what, were it not for this relationship, I'm fine, but this relationship has really done a number on me. Mm-hmm. But the longer the exposure, the more we see things like the self-blame, the confusion, the rumination, the anxiety, the vigilance, the isolation, the loneliness, and even we see a lot of physiological health issues. I have a healing program of thousands of survivors who come together every month for workshops and question and answer sessions. And we once hit a straw poll, have you ever either been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition or and we gave them a list of symptoms consistent with autoimmune presentations? 70% of them endorsed yes. To give you a sense of what that looks like epidemiologically, the rate of autoimmune diagnoses in the population is 3%. So even if we eked that up to 10% to account for symptomatology, 70%. Everything from chronic headaches to fatigue to muscle aches to frank, diagnosed autoimmune conditions, everything from lupus to fibromyalgia to Crohn's, you name it. People who also were saying the course of other severe acute illnesses, cancers, were much worse than even their oncologists could make sense of. These were people who were also saying that their self-care had lagged. So they were delayed sometimes on even getting preventative health screenings because they were so caught up in the chaos of the relationship, sometimes with tragic consequences. More than a few people said, by the time I waited 3 years to get X or Y screening, I came to find out I had stage 3 cancer. And they could say, I was so caught up in the madness of this relationship that I'm like, I'll get to that mammogram. I'll get to that screening. And time went on. That is how absorbing this can be. So it's not just the physiological toll that kind of stress exposure can result in. It's also the lapses in self-care, changes in sleep, changes in maybe even diet, nutrition, you name it, that all can happen.
Yeah, I mean, so many people listening might be like, "Oh no, like that, like how is that possible?" I mean, I can't tell you how many guests now that's come up the mind-body connection.
Oh yes.
I mean, Ellen Langer, that's like the originator of mind body, but Terry Cole was also another. She talks about this, and I mean, it's just a fact. I mean, even if you think about the mind and the gut being connected, and the vagus nerve, and like there's so many things that are interconnected, and so that the damage that happens isn't just mental, but it also is like a physical toll, and then you start having all these disorders popping up. Like, where is this coming from? And it's all coming from emotional trauma. And so, I mean, it struck me in your book that this is a personal topic for you, right? And so. You at one point in your life you couldn't tell which way was up, and so if you were to guide someone both from a personal but also a clinical perspective on the road to healing from this, what would you have to say about that?
You can't do it alone. It is, we human beings heal in community. We always have. We do not heal alone. In fact, even the Western model of healthcare, of one healthcare professional dealing with one person, that's not how it's done. It's we come together in community, and it's social support. I mean, that can look like therapy. It can look like therapy groups. It can look like friends. It doesn't always be that you're talking about this relationship. But the harm of emotionally abusive relationships and narcissistically harmful relationships is because we get isolated and when we feel like we're the only one going through this. So I would say other people is key. Even if it's just, you're not talking about this, like I said, you're just being with other people. You're being seen accurately by another person. All of that is a big part of healing. Talking about it. Now, I don't mean that you just have to incessantly talk to other people, finding other modes of expression. For some people, that's journaling. For some people, it's the expressive arts. We have found remarkable outcomes. We had 1 month in our healing program where we had people sort of construct almost like this vision board type of thing that would sort of capture their process of healing. One woman in our community created something out of an old suitcase that had some histories in narcissistic relationships for her. And she turned it into this 3-level story of her. I'd never seen anything so beautiful in my life. And she said, I got so absorbed in this task. There were people who said, I never picked up a paintbrush. I never picked up a piece of clay. So expressive arts also become an outlet. However you can get it out of here, and even out of here, and into whatever medium mode. I say journaling doesn't always have to be writing. Sometimes it can be talking. So whatever can get it out of here. So you can sometimes see it. That gives it new texture. That's another big piece of it. Paying attention to your body. We think we've forgotten things, right? It's all held here. So sometimes somatic work can really be quite helpful for people who are trying to work through these sorts of relationships in all kinds of ways. Sometimes it's very simple, just grounding to the body, paying attention to where you feel it when you're feeling sort of activated by something. Like we don't do enough in the body. When I went to graduate school back in the early 90s, we didn't even talk about the body when we talked about trauma. So this is all pretty recent, and now people are going back and learning about it. So that also becomes an important piece of it. And then figuring out who you are apart from this relationship. When people get caught in really, really emotionally abusive relationships, the entire frame of reference becomes almost a constant reaction to the relationship. I'm going to do this to show him. I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm like, let's take them out. Like, what are you going to do? Like, let's talk about what's important to you. So the meaning and purpose leaning work. And I don't mean you got to write the great book or that you have to paint a mural on the side of a public building. It could literally be something as, there's a food bank in my town. And I've always wondered what it would have been like. You know, like I feel like people, I can't believe we live in a time where not everyone has enough to eat. And going that one time a week, people say that feels more whole to them, or fostering a pet. Or my favorite was this woman said her husband hated this particular kind of cake. So she never made it, even like the smell of it. And he was very malignant narcissist. So the minute they split up, she baked like 10 of them and she gave them to a domestic violence program. She's like, that felt so good because she loved the particular cake. And so it's these things that people can do to lean into meaning and purpose. Then at some point I said, now you want the cake, bake the cake. Don't make it because he didn't like it. Make it because you like it. So it's moving, it's decentering the narcissist and centering into your own meaning, purpose, and value. And a lot of people will say, I don't even know what I want on pizza. I don't even know what kind of movies I like to watch.
Restoring agency.
It's agency, but it's also what feels right. And I'll say, you get to pick up the phone. And I've had literally clients pick up whatever the app, the food ordering app. Well, let's do it now. Get that pizza ordered. What's it going to be? And they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, come on, what do you want on a pizza? And they'll sit like, I've always wondered what olives would be like, but my ex told me nobody gets olives on a pizza. Order the olives. You know, and it is as simple as order the olives. That's the you separate from the relationship. One woman said, she said, after 45 years of a marriage, I stayed in a hotel alone for one night and I felt like a grown up. Another woman said, I'm terrified to go to the airport alone. And so I said, I want you to pay attention to what it feels like. And she said, you know what was funny? The thing that was so great was I was so used to him walking 5 to 10 paces ahead of me. And I had a pit in my stomach the whole time because he would scream at the lady at the counter and then scream at the flight attendant. He'd always take the aisle seat. And she had some health issues, so she needed to go to the bathroom a lot. And she said, I had no pit in my stomach. So it was there's all this beautiful stuff that you can notice. And that's what we're doing, bringing the person back to themselves, individuated, autonomous, getting to know the true self that's buried under all these piles. I call the piles of broken dishes. Getting under there, it's an excavation. That's really, how they take the little brush and
it's a process, a long process.
It takes a long time. And you know what? And I was talking to a colleague of mine, Dr. Ingrid Clayton, who's just written a brilliant book on fawning, and she said, and her and I were, and I was quite upset. I was listening to someone speak and they were talking about, we're all fully going to heal and we're never going to think about this again. And her and I got incensed. I said, I don't want people to think of healing as this eternal sunshine of the spotless mind. Yeah. I said that we carry these wounds and they are, at times they're weights, at times they're fellow travelers, and at times they're the most beautiful parts of ourselves, but it doesn't all just go away. And either it's carried here, sometimes it creates the beautiful things we do in life. Sometimes it sets off a gorgeous empathy in us, but it doesn't go away. And that's okay.
One of the most sensitive aspects so that's a whole process, but one of the most sensitive aspects at the end, call it at the end. I mean, I've talked to Frank Anderson about this. Like he has this whole healing arc of trauma. There's a healing of relational trauma, healing, repair, all of these things happen. And he talks about the idea of forgiveness being a kind of last step part of it. I mean, not everybody has to do that, but not as a sign of basically excusing someone's behavior, but almost as a form of releasing resentment and starting anew. I wanted to get your take on that, and also he talked about this in the lens with his father, but being able to see how that person arrived at their type of behavior was healing for him, and the dad was very abusive to him, and so. But it took him. He's 60 years old now. It took him a very long time to come to those.
And his
places.
dad passed.
Yeah, And so I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, I take a very unique position on this. I don't think forgiveness is necessary for healing, not by a long shot. I think that because remember, to forgive is, the dictionary definition, is to cease to feel resentment towards an offender. Okay? The resentment is still part of that trauma fight response. It was a recognition that something wrong was done. That's not a bad thing, right? I think that what we do is we command forgiveness so early in the process for so many people. It's viewed as used as an eraser. If you forgive, you'll feel fine.
It's like trivializing it, yeah.
A lot of people shame people who don't forgive. And a lot of people who don't forgive are painted as sort of dark-hearted and rigid and cold. There's actually very interesting research that suggests that forgiving and then being repeatedly harmed by the offender actually has negative mental health tolls. So if the person who's harming you is still alive and is still in your life and can still betray you or invalidate you or manipulate you, forgiveness is actually not a good idea. In fact, it's called the doormat effect. It's just not good for you. What I've seen with many people, they said, you're saying we don't have to forgive to heal has been one of the most liberating things we've ever heard, because people were getting stuck at that step. Once again, where are they stuck? They're stuck in still having to please the person who harmed them. I've got to forgive them. I've got to let this go. The challenge with forgiveness is, if you forgive someone, I think a lot of people think, well, if I forgive them, something's magically going to lift. That doesn't happen. But I'll say to people, if you forgive them and they do this again, what's that going to feel like? And like, well, and they won't have an answer. And so it's to say, if you forgive, because that is an organic process to you, that's fine. If you don't forgive, because you're recognizing the harm that this person has brought to your life in a different way, that's fine too. If you don't forgive for 30 years, that's fine. If you never forgive, that's fine. You can still heal. And I think this is crucial because I've had very, very heated, intense discussions. But when you talk to survivors firsthand, and I say this even, there has been traumatizing, emotionally harmful relationships I've been through where I do have forgiveness. Exactly what you're saying with Frank. I understand this person's process. I understand who they were. I wish it wasn't that. It hurt me. I wish my life didn't have that in it. It did. For complex reasons, I forgive. And there's people who have harmed me. I will never forgive them for what they did to me. Never. And I will contend. And I've actually healed really fine from those relationships. And the only thing that makes me sick is I know that they're continuing to harm other people in the same way. My healing was not impeded. In fact, by giving myself permission to recognize that these people's behavior hasn't changed. They're still doing this. I can't stop it. It actually emboldened me to say, this is okay. Like, I'm seeing it. Because to forgive meant almost to me felt like not seeing it clearly. And so many, 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 many survivors have said this repositioning has helped them a lot. And I think that a lot of people assume that forgiveness always means that it's just going to be sort of this hallmark picture perfect ending. And when a person keeps harming after forgiveness, and some people say the person died, I said, I don't even know if you'd call it forgiveness now. I guess they can't hurt me anymore. And some people say they don't get to forgiveness. They say, I've let it go. It's done. It's no longer affecting my life. But they look at all the ways they were hurt in life and they're like, yeah, no, it wasn't forgivable. And this is not just narcissistic relationships. Someone who's very close to me, Kimberly Shannon Murphy, wrote a book on severe childhood sexual abuse. And she said it point blank, I will never, ever forgive that. I was a child, and she said it didn't hurt my healing one bit. And I've heard this echoed by so many thousands of survivors that I've never forgiven, and I feel better for it.
When you speak, I think of Daniel Kahneman. He died last year, and famous Nobel Prize winner and psychologist. He talked about how the brain is an associative machine. And it's so interesting when you think about when we see symbols or we hear certain words. We've been talking about the word narcissist before. And so when I think when I hear you speak, I hear so much nuance in the way that you're navigating this topic. And so a lot of people hear the word forgiveness and it might mean 10,000 different things because it's not just a word. There's a memory, there's a trauma, there's so many things associated with it. There's maybe a religious context or whatever. There's the dilution of the word. And so if we were to just define it, how would you define forgiveness?
I mean, again, the dictionary is to cease to feel resentment towards an offender, right? Which we know absolutely was. I say to people, do you no longer resent them? Like, I resent the hell out of them. I said, well, then you didn't forgive them. So like, I'm letting you off the hook. So I think that forgiving someone is, I have released my negative feelings about the harm that they have perpetrated. And I take it to mean that there can be something even, I mean, collaborative is too strong a word, but that we can move forward with that recognition that I have released this negative feeling about what you've done.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a sensitive topic because
really
there's
is,
so much trauma and so many connotations. I think for me, when I hear it, it's like, I don't think that person even needs to know. Like, if you're going to make that decision, they don't need to know necessarily. It might not even be proper for you to tell them that, oh, I forgive you or something, especially if it's going to incite these cycles of abuse. And so I just think that there's so much nuance in the conversation. I think to flatten it and to just use this universal definition or universal application for every single human being on earth, no matter what they've experienced, is to not enter into the complexity of their own experience, you know? And I think that there's so much an individual needs to work through to even get to that point. And we don't want to be doing things that would incite more cycles of abuse, which is what I hear you saying, you know? So
that's what it is. And I think it is also, though, that where so much of the resentment around this forgiveness piece is that it did feel like it was a mandate, like you said, often through a religious tradition, but often even through a familial tradition. People who had experienced either emotional or other forms of harm in family system, or even people witnessed happening to them as adults. And the family system saying, just forgive them. They didn't mean it. So they're already making an attributional error because you don't know that they meant it or not. But it's basically the system wanting to return to the status quo, and that what ends up happening is that so it's no longer the person who did the perpetration or the harm that's in the hot seat. It's the person who won't forgive that's in the hot seat, and they didn't do anything. They were the one harmed. Weird, yeah. That's where it gets twisted, and that's what keeps happening. That's why this conversation is so fraught for survivors of these relationships. It's a very personal process. And you were saying how, I don't know that we should tell someone we forgive them. I actually think it's more important that you don't tell them you don't forgive them. You know, never say that, because I think that's where people say, I'm never going to forgive you. And that's where it all becomes twisted. I say, this is a personal process. You don't have to tell them you're going to forgive them. You don't have to tell them you're not going to forgive them. This is something you do on your own time. But I think the fear for a lot of people is, if I don't forgive them, I can't heal. What I'm saying is you're going to heal just fine, because that means if you're really plumbing the depths of this, if you're thinking about this, saying, I can't get this time back. I can't get I can't get this. Think of it, there's people out there who've said, I stayed in this relationship because they kept promising me we're going to have kids, we're going to have kids, we're going to have kids. We never had kids. That was the one thing I wanted to have happen in my life, and now it's too late. Like, I can't forgive that. I missed and then they'll sometimes hear criticism like, well, you should have taken responsibility for your life. Well, then that shows absolutely no understanding of how relational trauma affects somebody and how they can't get unstuck. So I think people who are harmed are actually the ones who keep walking into walls as they're trying to make sense of it. And they're actually the ones who are more likely to be shut down by the world. And again, when you look at Judith Herman's work, she so eloquently says it, you know, in all of her books, the sense that the trauma survivor really gets sacrificed on the altar of the just world and the preservation of the status quo. We would rather leave the trauma survivor out there to suffer on their own than to admit that such danger exists in our midst.
Yeah, Yeah, I think the forgiveness could be its own podcast episode. Yeah, there's just so much to unpack there. The last thing I wanted to ask you is, we there's such a beautiful arc that you've been developing throughout this conversation of, where we've been, clarifying, getting right on the terms, how to navigate through these things. What is the future you see, the next 5 years, 10 years in this conversation? What would you like to see happen?
What I would like to see is, in the last 25 years, you've been hearing more talk about being more trauma informed. I would like us to be more antagonism informed. I'd like people to be aware of how this is patterned and how it is important to not reward it. Our justice system, for example, is not antagonism informed. And again, we're in a tough place because I don't know that you can use antagonism to inform even things like sentencing decisions, and certainly even how we handle ourselves in courtrooms. They're not trauma informed. We'll ask a sexual assault survivor to keep having to recount her tale of abuse over and over while the perpetrator is in the room, because we want to give the perpetrator a fair trial with no regard for how this is affecting the other person. So these systems don't work. So we need antagonism-informed justice systems. We need antagonism-informed leadership programs. We need to understand how these personality styles affect people, because we are so quick to aggrandize these styles. Oh, they're charismatic. They're just confident. Like, we still have this almost cartoonish image. But to me, though, one of the most important pieces of this work is that we be able to measure it, to actually measure what these relationships do to people, something we're actively now pursuing now and actually getting the data on, number one. Number two, training therapists on this. The average graduate student, now still in 2025, does not will probably go through all of graduate school not having heard the word narcissism once. I didn't learn about it. I did not learn about for even a second in graduate school. We didn't talk about personality disorders. We didn't talk about personality. My first training was in my clinical training year after I finished all my doctoral study. One particular patient it came up in, and that's the only thing. Anything else that happened was all postdoctoral training that I pursued on my own. We're not teaching students. So I have training programs for therapists, but we need to train therapists. We need to give value to qualities that create social ties, like empathy, like compassion. With each passing day, those traits are actually getting more mired in shame. We are entering an era of antagonism where it's valued. We're in trouble. I think you only need to open the first page of an app that talks about the news. My game is I look through the headlines, and once I hit 10 antagonism stories, I get out of bed. I'm usually out of bed in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, it's just the air we breathe.
It's the air we breathe. So I think we need to be a more antagonism-informed world. We need to believe survivors. We need trained therapists. We need more empathy-oriented curricula in schools. We need to do more work with kids on building a sense of self. We need to protect children from trauma. I mean, as all of us in this field will say, if you protected every child from trauma, every therapist would lose their jobs tomorrow. It's that simple. You want to address the mental health epidemic in this country? Stop harming children and stop not protecting. We've got to protect kids. We don't protect kids. So this is a much bigger issue, but that's what I see next. And so as I continue to write about it and think about it, it's and again, even like thinking about things like neurodivergence and how do we bring that, is how do we keep having a really global yet nuanced conversation about this in the most compassionate way possible, without making it seem like if one more person ever asked me, can you tell us the 5 steps to healing from narcissistic relationships? I'm like, what are you talking about? This isn't baking banana bread. Like, there's no 5 steps here. And I think that when we try to oversimplify what is really soul work, that's dangerous. And so it's let survivors know something real happened to you, and this is going to take a minute.
That's beautiful. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for this conversation.
Yeah.